There are few names in music history that are as important and as iconic as Johnny Cash. His legacy really cannot be overstated. There are few people who saw as much as he did and did as much as he did. So, this is his story. Whenever I do a video like this about a super iconic and loved and well known person, it's always a little intimidating because there's just been hours and hours and hours of content already created about Johnny Cash. I don't think I can add anything new to this. I think I'm going to be rehashing a lot of the same stuff. Plus, his career was so long, his life was so interesting that I just kind of have to gloss over some stuff. I can't possibly cover everything in depth, which means there's going to be a lot of very abridged things in this video. Or maybe Ajax will just... Okay, that's not going to sound good. Oh, are you tired? So if you're watching this video and think, well, you missed something there, or you should have talked more about this, then you're right. But this is just what I had the time for, trying to tell his story as completely as I possibly could. If you end up enjoying the video despite all of the shortcomings I just said, please give it a like and consider subscribing so you don't miss out on more stories from music history.
I remember when I was a lad, times were hard and things were bad.
John R. Cash was born in Arkansas in 1932, and soon after that, the family moved to Dyess County as a part of a government project. Essentially, they were given this land on the condition that they had to farm it and pay back what the government gave them. It turns out it wasn't easily farmable land, so JR, as Johnny was then known, remembered his dad and his brother attacking it day and night trying to clear their property. JR wasn't expected to start picking cotton until he turned 6, so he spent some of his days listening to gospel music with his mom or country music with his older brother Roy on like a little radio that his dad bought the family. Johnny's other brother Jack was largely seen as the golden child. He was hardworking and smart, and he made up his mind really early that he would be a minister when he grew up. Instead of being jealous of all of the attention that Jack was getting, JR loved Jack. One day, Jack wanted to earn his family a little bit of extra money by helping the school make fence posts, so he went to the school and was working the saw, but the saw slipped and tore into his stomach. About a week later, he died in the hospital. And I don't think JR or Johnny ever really fully recovered from that loss. He said later in life that he always dreamed about Jack, saying, quote, "His beard is gray now. His hair is gray. He's always been there. He's aged with me." He also said that he worked through the grief 40 years later in therapy. That death haunted the family. According to some stories, JR's father even told him that God took the wrong child, implying that it should have been Johnny that died instead of Jack. And he's still going by JR at this point, but I'm going to call him Johnny because that just kind of makes more sense with the story instead of calling him several different names. So he's Johnny now. In the wake of this tragedy, Johnny started to think of ways that he could carry on Jack's legacy. One day, while he was walking down the road and just singing gospel songs to himself, he had the idea that he could follow in Jack's footsteps and promise to join the ministry, except as a gospel singer instead of as a preacher. His mom was overjoyed about that, but his father kind of tried to discourage him from following that dream. His father said, quote, "I wanted him to start preparing for the day when he'd be on his own and have to take care of his family." And that day came in 1950 when Johnny signed up for the Air Force right at the start of the Korean War and went to San Antonio for basic training, where he met Vivian. Vivian Liberto was 17 and out skating before a sleepover with some friends. Johnny, who had just gone to the movie theater with some of his buddies, saw her and his friends dared him to go introduce himself, so maybe being a little nervous, he accidentally skated into her, knocking her down. The attraction was instant and heavy, but Johnny left for Germany a few weeks later. They kept up a steady stream of letters while he was over there, though, and it was kind of understood between them that whenever he got back, then they would get married. While in Germany, while working as part of kind of an advanced group of Morse code operators, where he might have been the first American to hear about Joseph Stalin's death, Johnny got to see a lot of Europe and work on his singing. He said in a letter home, quote, "I think I've improved my voice. I guess it's only natural. When I'm not working or sleeping, that's about all I do, is listen to music or play it." He also started working on his own songs. He heard a song called Crescent City Blues, and he remembered a documentary he watched not too long before that about Folsom Prison. And he had this idea to create this ballady, bluesy song about life in prison, but it would take him a few months before he really nailed that one down. After leaving the Air Force, Johnny married Vivian in 1954, and they settled into life in Memphis, Tennessee, where Johnny got work selling furniture, though he was never very good at it, and he became even more determined to make a career in the music industry. That's where he first heard about Sun Records and Sam Phillips.
Because you're mine, I walk the line.
Sam Phillips is a whole different video, so let me know if you want me to make that. Use the comments below. Johnny heard that Sam would be willing to record Complete Unknowns, as he had done with Elvis, if they showed enough talent. Talent that Johnny thought he now had. While Johnny was trying to pin Sam down long enough to audition for him, he kept calling the Sun Records offices and being told that Sam was out of town on other business, so he couldn't find a time to meet him. He started playing with a band while he was waiting to get in touch with Sam. I'm trying this new fancy Tom Holland non-alcoholic beer, and it's pretty good. I'm not a big non-alcoholic beer guy, but, worth a shot. Johnny's older brother, Roy, who was helping Johnny out quite a lot after he moved to Memphis. Roy was a little bit more settled, so he, I think, introduced him to the guy who got him the job in the furniture store and was just like helping feed him and just a lot of good older brother stuff. But Roy introduced Johnny to two mechanics that he worked with named Luther Perkins and Marshall Grant, who were both a little older than Johnny. They were more Roy's age. They made arrangements to start playing together, and at the start, they sounded pretty bad. Luther and Marshall kind of saw it as something fun to do after work, while Johnny, who became the unofficial leader, took it more seriously. Once Luther learned that Johnny could write songs, he started thinking that there might be something to this. Johnny finally managed to track Sam down, and he auditioned at Sun Records for a couple of hours, and Sam was kind of impressed. He thought that Johnny had that star factor and that charisma, kind of like he saw in Elvis, but he wasn't sure if Johnny was auditioning as a solo singer, as part of a band, and Johnny didn't really have the right song, so Sam told him, if you find a good song to record, I'd be happy to record you. Which led to April 1st, 1954, when Johnny signed a contract with Sun Records. He signed it on behalf of his band, who called themselves the Tennessee Three. Sam actually wanted to position Johnny as the leader, so he suggested calling them John Cash and the Tennessee Two. He thought it was like a little bit more personal sounding than the Tennessee Three. Johnny also said that he liked the name Johnny more because it sounded more youthful, so they became Johnny Cash and the Tennessee Two. Johnny agreed to split all the money made evenly with Luther and Marshall, and that worked for them, so they started recording. Johnny managed to talk a local radio station into giving him his own show time so he could promote his band. And a few days after his very awkward first broadcast, Vivian gave birth to their first daughter, Roseanne. While still working full-time, the Tennessee Three started touring the South, playing nights and weekends, trying to get country fans to pay attention to their records. During that time, both Johnny and Vivian got a little concerned about the temptation of the women on the road, so Johnny wrote a song about it, called I Walk the Line. It became his first ever country #1 in 1956 and earned him his first performance on stage at the Grand Ole Opry. Despite some serious nerves on both sides, his Opry show was a huge success. Audiences and critics loved him and positioned him as the next big thing in country music. Johnny said, quote, I am grateful, happy, and humble. It is the ambition of every hillbilly singer to reach the Opry in his lifetime. It's the top for us. But it wasn't the time to slow down. Despite having a massive hit song, the band wasn't living comfortably. They were still driving themselves to shows in the middle of working full-time on these just back roads all night. It was exhausting. They were away from their families all the time. So when Don Law came calling with an offer from Columbia Records, Johnny was tempted. Even though Sun Records and Sam Phillips had given him his start and had introduced him to the world, Don Law could offer him a lot more money and a lot more attention. They offered him a big advance and a 2-cent higher royalty rate if he signed with Columbia once his Sun contract expired. The money wasn't the only thing that was tempting Johnny away from Sun. Sam had recently brought in a new producer named Jack Clement that the Tennessee Three weren't thrilled to be working with. He was much more tight-knuckled than Sam as a producer. Also, Johnny thought that Sam was paying more attention to Jerry Lee Lewis, who was kind of like the new star, and Sam wouldn't let him record gospel music, which Johnny desperately wanted to do, kind of hearkening back to his promise to his parents and to his dead brother Jack that one day he would go into the ministry singing gospel songs. But Johnny still wasn't sure. I mean, after all, he was loyal to Sun, so he came to Sam without talking about Columbia, and he asked Sam if he'd be willing to up his royalty rate at all. Later, Johnny would say that he would have stuck with Sun if Sam offered him even a 1-cent higher royalty rate. Even though Johnny was the highest selling artist on the label, Sam didn't offer him anything. I've been everywhere, man. So, Johnny Cash signed with Columbia and moved his whole operation to Nashville. Johnny would later say about Sam Phillips, quote, I have so much respect for Sam. He worked so hard and did so much good for people like me. If there hadn't been a Sam Phillips, I might still be working in a cotton field. 1957 was the year he signed with Columbia, but it was massive for Johnny in at least one other way. It was the first time he took an amphetamine. Gordon Terry, a musician from Georgia, heard Johnny complaining about how tired he was and how he wasn't sure if he could even make the show the next night. So Gordon introduced introduced him to the old country musician's trick, amphetamines. The roads down south are long, and these guys would often be playing every single night, sometimes more than once a night, so they used these pills to keep alert on the drives. I mean, they would play a show, drive all night, maybe sleep a little bit if they could, and then play another show. It was just grueling and exhausting, even for people at the top of the game like Johnny Cash. So Johnny took one of these pills and it worked immediately. He was more alert, he was more awake, he was even more confident when he went on stage to perform. Pretty quickly, he was taking more than Gordon or anyone else would ever recommend he take, and his addiction to amphetamines would wreak havoc on the rest of his life. In 1958, Johnny Cash bought Johnny Carson's home in Encino and moved out to California. He was getting a little tired of the Nashville country industry, and he was flirting with the idea of acting in movies. Plus, he had basically fallen in love with a singer who lived out there named Lori Collins. But Johnny was 26 and Lori was 16, and in the wake of the Jerry Lee Lewis controversy, people were a little bit nervous about that, as is expected and as they should be. Plus, Johnny's marriage with Vivian was already pretty rocky due to his constant touring, his increased drug and alcohol use. Anytime that he had even a little break from touring, he would get restless after like 2 days. Just wasn't a good environment for his family. And at least according to Johnny, Vivian never fully understood or supported his music career. She wanted him to be a good father and a good husband and stay home and take care of his family, when all he wanted to do was be on the road writing and singing and recording songs. So as Johnny wrote later in one of his autobiographies, quote, "By the time we left Memphis for California, we had 3 daughters and a marriage in bad trouble." End quote. So his marriage is falling apart, which created a really deep sense of guilt in him, both because he wanted to be a good father, he wanted to be a good husband, and he had that deep religion in him that was telling him that divorce was wrong and was a sin. So that, combined with easier access to drugs and alcohol as his career is taking off, left him in a pretty dark place personally. Plus, Luther and Marshall had already gotten really tired of California, so they moved back home to Memphis, which left Johnny a little bit isolated from anyone who could ground him, anyone who knew him before the fame and fortune. The end of the 50s and the start of the 60s were a massive time for Johnny. He had several huge songs, and his live shows were famous because of his onstage charisma. It seemed like he could do no wrong. His career was also helped because he had recorded a ton before he left Sun. They wanted to capitalize on him while they still had him under contract, so they just had him in the studio nonstop, which means that they were releasing Johnny Cash new albums at the same time that Columbia was releasing Johnny Cash new albums. So there was just a ton of new Johnny Cash music on the market. But this was also when his personal life was falling apart, and the guilt of it started to eat him alive. This was the period where Johnny's drug use first spiraled out of control. He learned how easy it was to get pills in Mexico, so he would go down there frequently. He became more unreliable and sometimes wouldn't even show up in a proper state to perform at some of the shows, but his career was accelerating. Things were running so fast in every direction, something was bound to fall off the tracks.
Come look through the window pane. The bus is coming, gonna take.
By 1961, Columbia was kind of debating if they should even bother re-signing Johnny. I think they saw the writing on the wall with his addiction struggles and his unreliability. They kind of knew what was coming. They had been in this game for a while. When Saul Holliff, who was a concert promoter from Canada, who had booked Johnny to play a couple shows and kind of saw that there was this gap here that he could fill, so he would eventually become Johnny's longtime manager. He went into the Columbia offices before he was even Johnny's manager. This was kind of his audition to become Johnny's manager, and he convinced them to re-sign Johnny to a really lucrative deal. A year before that, W.S. Holland joined the group as a drummer, so they became the Tennessee Three from then on. Bringing a drummer into a country group was kind of revolutionary for that time. Some older members of the country audience were not responding well to rock and roll, and they wanted to keep all of that mess out of country, so anything with a backbeat, anything with a driving rhythm, they were very skeptical of, but Johnny didn't care. He thought the song sounded better with a drummer, so he brought in a drummer. On tours in the early 60s, Johnny was turning into a wreck. He would take so many pills that he could barely perform. He was booking his own shows and doing a bad job of it. As Marshall Grant said about trying to get Johnny to record, quote, "With the drugs and his personal problems, we were having a hard time getting him into the studio. Even when Law," talking about Don Law, his producer and the Columbia exec, "would schedule a session, we would never know if he'd show up or what condition he'd be in." There's a kind of famous story of Johnny Cash and George Jones being on a tour together. Johnny was a few years further along in his career than George Jones. He had been there and done that already. George Jones was also in the midst of spiraling out of control with his own alcohol addiction. So George, when he got drunk, would often get a little bit violent and start tearing things apart. So in their hotel room, he like broke a lamp and Johnny was just sitting on the bed and he'd be like, "That's $30." And then George would break something else and he'd say, "That's $50." Just keeping this tab of how much the hotel would charge George Jones for that thing he broke, because Johnny had already broken it all already and had already been charged for every item in there. So George was kind of like, let's make a game of this. Let's see if I can break something that Johnny Cash hasn't broken. He couldn't, and Johnny was spot on in all of his charges. I think he missed like 2 lamps, but other than that, got it spot on. Probably because of the turmoil in his personal life, his singles were also declining. Radio DJs were not playing them. They noticed the problems that the drugs started to cause with his voice, but Johnny didn't really pay attention to any of that. People still packed his concerts, and that was good enough for him.
I fell into a ring of fire.
By virtue of being on the same country music circuits, Johnny had met June Carter before. They kind of famously met behind the Grand Ole Opry in an alley that connected the Ryman Auditorium where the Grand Ole Opry was staged with Tootsie's, a very famous honky-tonk bar on Broadway. They met in that alley, and at least according to June, Johnny said that he was going to marry her one day. This was back in like the late 50s when both of them were still married. So even though they had met before, in late 1961, June really made an impression on Johnny. No pun intended. She was scheduled to play the Big D Jamboree with Johnny in Dallas, and she needed a ride to Oklahoma City to play with Johnny again the next day. So she went up to the group and asked if they had room in their car. Their car was already full, but she said, "That's fine, I'll sit on someone's lap," which caused Johnny to say, "As long as mine is the lap she sits on." And never mind that they were both still married to other people at this point. June Carter was a part of a historic family. Her mother, Maybelle, was part of the Carter family, who are, I would say, the most important group in the history of country music. They were there from the very beginning, recording with Ralph Peer at the Bristol sessions. I have a whole video talking about the birth of country music where I talk more about Ralph Peer and the Bristol sessions, so check that video out if you want a little bit more information. But the Carter family deserved their own video, one that I do want to make, so subscribe so you don't miss out on that video. Maybelle went on to pioneer country guitar playing, but once the Carter family split up, Maybelle kept playing with her daughters, including June. That country music authenticity was really appealing to Johnny. He was coming out of a pretty big heartbreak. He had fallen in love with Billie Jean Horton, who was the widowed wife of first Hank Williams and then Johnny Horton, who Johnny Horton was one of Johnny Cash's really good friends, and once he passed away, he was there to comfort Billie Jean, but whenever Johnny suggested that he and Billie Jean should get married, she turned him down. So coming out of that heartbreak in the midst of all of this personal turmoil, June came into his life at a very fortunate time, or unfortunate, depending on whose story you're telling, I guess. They started touring together, and they both felt like it was only a matter of time until they got together. Johnny said, quote, "I was enthralled. Here was this vivacious, exuberant, funny, happy girl, and talented and spirited and strong-willed as they come, and she was bringing out the best in me. It felt wonderful." But the best of him wasn't quite there, as evidenced by the disastrous Carnegie Hall show. Saul, his manager, booked him to play Carnegie in 1962, and Johnny kind of got in his head about it. He knew how famous Carnegie Hall was, and he also knew that his sales numbers and his attention was declining, so he thought this could be a chance to respark his career, but that added pressure that he put on himself made him take way more pills than he should have taken, and he was essentially comatose for the time leading up to the show, and his voice was so wrecked that it was barely above a whisper during the show. By all accounts, it was a complete and total disaster. And then after playing a show in California where Vivian and his daughters attended and waited for him after the show, Johnny just kind of completely ignored them and quickly ran off with June, which was when Vivian made the connection that something was happening between June and Johnny. Her increasingly volatile affair with Johnny Cash inspired June to write the song Ring of Fire, which she initially gave to her sister Anita to record, but Johnny loved that song, and then he said he had a dream about mariachi horns on it, so he got mariachi horns and recorded his own version, which became another smash hit for Johnny Cash. And despite finding success again, Johnny continued to do things the way he wanted to, regardless of what the country industry wanted. He released an album called Bitter Tears, which was a concept album about Native Americans. The country establishment and his own label really didn't want to promote it, but the general public was starting to see Johnny as an actual artist. Johnny kept making the music he believed in, no matter what the industry told him to do. In October of 1965, Johnny was arrested during one of his drug buying trips to Mexico, and that got him some really bad publicity. Someone photographed him with Vivian during his trial in El Paso. She showed up to actually support him for that, and that led to so much backlash because people assumed she was African American, and that made a ton of racists really upset, to the point that Saul went to Vivian's father for a copy of her marriage certificate so he could send it to the racist magazines to prove that she was white, which is just so ridiculous in so many ways. So with his relationship with Vivian breaking down, Johnny moved out of his home in Los Angeles with Vivian and into an apartment in Nashville with Waylon Jennings, who was also suffering from his own addictions. Finally, in 1966, Vivian had enough and filed for divorce from Johnny. His daughter, Kathy, said that when Vivian told her they were getting a divorce, it didn't really impact her all that much because she never saw her father anyway. So she was like, what does it matter if his clothes aren't here?
Over again. Every time I think of you.
Bob Johnston was a producer who came to Columbia and immediately had massive success working with Bob Dylan and Simon and Garfunkel. When Johnny met Bob, he thought Bob might be a producer who would listen to some of his ideas that the more establishment-minded Don Law might not, so Johnny started working with him. One of the first ideas Johnny pitched was a live album recorded at a prison. That's how Johnston, the Tennessee Three, June, and Johnny wound up at Folsom Prison in January of 1968 to record a full live album. That album, released a few months later in May, is widely seen as one of the greatest albums of all time and is my personal favorite country album ever created. It received incredible reviews right away, despite Columbia initially barely pushing it. They wanted to focus more on pop stars at that time. It was another vindication that Johnny knew what he was doing, sometimes, even if that was against what the industry told him to do. In between the recording and the release of Live at Folsom Prison, Johnny and June got married at a little ceremony in Kentucky, even though June always said she wouldn't marry him until he got sober. But everyone knew it was only a matter of time before they got married. A theme with the Johnny Cash story is that when things are going great, they don't stay that way for long. In August of 1968, Luther Perkins, one of the original Tennessee Two, fell asleep while holding a lit cigarette and passed away from the resulting fire. Johnny had earlier gotten Luther into pills, and he always blamed himself for Luther's death because he assumed Luther took pills before falling asleep with that cigarette. Despite that personal tragedy, the entertainment industry was waking up to the commercial appeal of Johnny Cash again. ABC approached him to do a TV show, which he was initially unsure of. Saul claimed that TV was the next stage of Johnny's career and convinced the production company to let him film at the Ryman in Nashville instead of in LA. They also said that Johnny would have input on the guests to make him feel more comfortable, so instead of bringing in actors or these musicians he didn't know, he could bring in his friends and people that he already had a rapport with, and it would just make things feel more natural because he wasn't exactly the most natural of people when he was on TV. So, with those promises, Johnny agreed to do a TV show. It started airing in June of 1969 and ran for 58 episodes, ending in 1971. Johnny quickly realized his input on guests was not taken that seriously. He had far less creative control than he wanted, and he quickly soured on the whole thing, though he did convince his friend Bob Dylan to be a guest, even though Dylan hated TV. In 1970, June gave birth to their son, John Carter Cash, which, more than anything, even the birth of his daughters kind of finally convinced Johnny to settle down and try and get sober for a while. Eventually, his partnership with Bob Johnston fizzled out and the two stopped working together. No one is really sure why. Maybe Johnny grew a little bit tired of Bob's revolutionary, anti-establishment, pushing back against the industry mindset. Or maybe Bob wouldn't let him focus on the gospel music that Johnny really wanted to record, but for whatever reason, they parted ways. Johnny had got really focused on gospel and preaching his religion. There's even rumors that his insistence on preaching the gospel during his show was what led to declining ratings, even though it seems like that would be a good overlap with his audience, so I don't know. With his show over and his focus on gospel music, the early 70s was a commercial downswing for Johnny. He also got heavily into film, really thinking that acting was his next big thing, so he wasn't writing as many songs. But I think Johnny was at least feeling creatively fulfilled with the projects he worked on during this period, like his film and double album Gospel Road, telling the story of Jesus. He also fired his longtime manager, Saul, so he was clearly feeling his new direction and trying to find his feet in that world. But in 1977, Johnny relapsed. It was first noticed by Marshall Grant, the person who had been around him the longest. He found Johnny incoherent in the dressing room and having flashbacks to the early 60s. He knew what was happening, and he was heartbroken. So was June, who also knew during the show that night what was going on with Johnny, and they both were remembering just how horrible it was when they were on tour with Johnny at his worst. But June was also descending further and further into her own addictions that I don't think she would ever fully admit that she had. And this was just a period of some intense struggle and tension within their marriage.
I remember everything.
In 1980, after a couple of fights and a period where they barely even talked, Johnny fired Marshall Grant via letter. Marshall thought about putting that letter in his 2006 memoir, but said it didn't feel right because he knew it was the drugs talking and that Johnny said things that he regretted in it. It's pretty sad how that relationship ended, with Marshall even suing Johnny for embezzlement, which prompted Luther's children to sue Johnny as well. Despite all of that, they would reconcile, and Marshall did appear with Johnny again on stage before he passed away in Arkansas in 2011 at the age of 83. He'd come a long way from Roy Cash's mechanic friend playing music for fun to one of the most important musicians in country music. Around Christmas of 1983, Johnny recognized that his pill addiction was spiraling out of control again, so he checked himself into rehab, and it was just a really good time of rest and healing for him. He said that that was the time that he finally started to come to terms with the grief of losing his brother when he was a kid. John Carter said when he went to visit Johnny in rehab, he saw that fire in Johnny's eyes again. Johnny spent 43 days in rehab, and when he got out, he was ready to really try and right the sinking ship of his career. He paired up with Waylon Jennings again, and they decided to form a group called the Highwaymen with Willie Nelson, Waylon Jennings, Johnny Cash, and Chris Christopherson. I think it was mostly Willie and Waylon who decided to start that group, but Johnny wanted in, and it was a massive success. People loved that project. They released an album. I think they went on a tour. Critics loved it. It's kind of seen as, depending on who you ask, either the birth or the culmination of the outlaw country movement. But in 1988, Johnny's lifetime of hard living and stress and kind of abusing his body with substances finally caught up to him, and he needed heart surgery. Waylon Jennings also had heart surgery in the same hospital at the same time, so they got to recover together, which was nice. But that was the start of health problems that would plague Johnny for the rest of his life. In 1993, a super popular hip-hop and rock producer known as Rick Rubin saw Johnny and thought that he still had more to give. Most of the industry gave up on Johnny, but Rick knew there was more there. So he started working with him, making a series of albums that were all incredibly well received. I have a whole video about Rick Rubin that I'll link in the description below, and I talk more about this partnership and relationship there, so if you want to hear more about it, check out that video. But it was something that, according to John Carter Cash, kept his dad alive. It gave him something to work on, and Johnny loved making music that he enjoyed again. On October 25th, 1997, Johnny gave what would be his last show in Flint, Michigan. He had trouble keeping his balance on stage. When the audience noticed, he let them know that he had Parkinson's disease. Johnny decided to just not let it have ground in his life, and he tried to ignore it, but that of course didn't work, and his health started really declining. During this time, after retiring from shows and living at home, was when he recorded the Hurt music video, which I believe is the best music video of all time. In 2003, after heart surgery, June Carter Cash passed away at the age of 73. Johnny's health had been failing for years, and people thought that June was the only reason he was still alive, so they kind of overlooked how bad June's addictions and health had gotten. All of the attention was on Johnny, so June kind of took a back seat to that. Johnny was obviously devastated, and John Carter suspected that his work with Rick Rubin was the only thing keeping him alive at that point. Rick said, quote, "His partner was gone, and his choice was to die or to carry on. He chose to carry on." A few months after that, Vivian was in town and stopped by to see Johnny one last time. She wanted his blessing to release a book that she was working on, which he quickly gave her, even though Vivian warned him that the book didn't always paint him in the best of light, and his fans might not react well to it, but Johnny said she needed to tell that story anyway, so she was able to release that book. Apparently, that was a really nice conversation, and they ended on really great terms. That was the last time Vivian would ever see her ex-husband. A few months later, in August of 2003, Johnny went into the studio at his home to record Like the 309, which would be the last song he recorded for Rick Rubin. Then he recorded Engine 143 for an album that John Carter was working on, which was like a Carter family tribute album. After recording over 1,500 songs and selling over 50 million albums, that would be the last song Johnny Cash ever recorded. On September 12th, 2003, Johnny Cash passed away of complications from diabetes at the age of 71. He's buried next to June and near Luther Perkins in Hendersonville, Tennessee. And that's the very abridged version of the Johnny Cash story. Let me know what you thought using the comments below. There's so much more to cover with Johnny Cash. I could have made 10 videos on his life, so share your favorite Johnny Cash anecdote, share your favorite Johnny Cash song in the comments below. Like the video if you enjoyed it, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on more stories from music history.